Committee. Chair of that committee is Jeff McMillan.
Thank you, Chairman Griggs. At this time, I want to recognize Chief of Fisheries, Bobby Wilson.
Thank you, Commissioner McMillan. Commissioners. About a year ago, I gave a presentation about Florida bass in Tennessee, and this is kind of the next step from that presentation. So before I get into recommendations on the proposal to stock it, I probably should go back a little bit and talk about what the status of the Florida bass is in Tennessee and some of the information I shared with you last year. And Gibson County Lake is an agency lake in West Tennessee. It's located around Trenton, Tennessee. It's about 560 acres or so. And when we stocked the lake, we stocked it with the fingerlings. Half of the fingerlings were northern or the native Tennessee bass, and half were pure Floridas. And this is a picture of a nice fish that was caught out of there. So a few years ago, oh, hang on a second. A few years ago, we want to do some genetics to see if some of the big bass coming out of this lake, what the makeup was, were they northerns or Floridas or what. And so we had the concessionaire. The concessionaire is a person who sells bait and tackle and also sells permits on site. They're not an employee of TWC. They just work under contract with TWC. And he would collect the fin clips off of some of the bigger bass that the fishermen came and brought out, or they checked out, or they wanted to get weighed at the concessionaire site. And so they weren't all real big. They were anywhere from 6 pounds and bigger. But from that, we learned that about the majority of them were Florida largemouth bass, or at least had some Florida bass genes in them. And the average weights of those, the Florida bass, averaged a little bit higher than that. That's just a kind of an indication. It doesn't tell us a lot. It just tells us that the Florida bass can make it in some places in Tennessee. And you may remember in Browns Creek Lake, which is also one of our agency-owned fishing lakes located within the boundaries of the Natchez Trace State Park. Our electrofishing crew shocked up a big bass back in October 2009. It was 16 pounds, 15 ounces. Our current state record for largemouth bass in Tennessee is 14 pounds, 8 ounces. It was caught in 1954. So over 60 years, the record still stands as 14.5 pounds, but this fish would have beat it if a fisherman had caught it by 2.5 pounds. And it turns out it was a pure Florida bass. So there again is another case where we think, at least in some cases, the Florida bass will thrive. And then in the big thing, of course, with Chickamauga Reservoir, folks started catching some big bass there back in 2010 and 2011 and beyond. So in Chickamauga, just a little bit about Chickamauga Lake. It's 36,000 surface acres. It's a eutrophic lake. It's located, as you can see in that little insert map there, it's located Chattanooga in the southeast corner of the state. Eutrophic, I'm sorry. Good question, Commissioner Cox. Eutrophic means it's a highly fertile lake, very fertile, as opposed to a oligotrophic, which is not so fertile, like something like Dale Hollow Lake or something like real clear water. So what about Chickamauga? Why would we even stock Chickamauga Lake? So there's a lot of folks down there that were very much in favor of trying this experimental stocking. We had a lot of support. We even had some of the Bass Club donate some money to TWRA to stock, provide fish for stocking. It's a moderate to high bass productivity, desirable growth rates. Consistent bass recruitment means that they spawn every year and that the spawn make it through the first year of growth. Got good shad populations, which of course equates to good food. Aquatic vegetation is real important. It's also in that area that's determined to be the natural zone of integration between the northern bass and the Florida largemouth bass. It also meets the qualifications outlined in our largemouth bass management plan. So we started stocking, and I got this map here to show you there they go. The stars indicate places where we stocked. The Gibson County Lake, Lake Graham, I haven't mentioned anything about that, but it's also an agency-owned state lake In Jackson, Tennessee, it's 500 acres. Browns Creek Lake, and then Harmons Creek is an embayment in Kentucky Lake, and we stocked it for a few years too. But then Chickamauga Lake, the big star down at southeast corner, was where we started. And when we did, the purpose was to increase the Florida bass genes to at least 15% and to produce big bass. Our purpose was not to increase or to stock these Florida bass to increase the number of Florida bass. It was to increase the Florida bass genes, if that makes sense. So we had a 5-year plan, and we stocked them lake-wide. We spread the fingerlings out throughout the lake at a rate of about 5 fingerlings per acre, and started testing them, the genetic results. And as you can see, the 3.3% in 2000, and 2001, 4.4, and 2002, 0.8. So it really wasn't we weren't getting the results that we'd hoped to get after the 5-year plan. We just weren't happy with it. So 2005, we decided to do a brand new plan. And so we decided to stock some major embayments, not just the entire lake like we did before, but we're going to just concentrate on putting them in embayments that have really good habitat. So we're putting the same number in there that we were putting in before, scattering throughout the lake. We just had a higher rate per acre if you consider the size of the embayments. And the fingerlings as well, that's one thing we started doing that we felt like, and still feel like, that was a good thing. We can spawn Florida bass at our hatcheries, but when we do, they spawn at the same time as the native or the northern largemouth do. So they don't really have any kind of size advantage when we stock them. But if we go down and get them from places further south like Florida or Louisiana or Texas and bring them up here, they're bigger. They're larger than the natives, and they can probably outcompete them or hold their own at least, and they won't get eaten up. So that was one thing we did. We started stocking the fingerlings at a larger size than the native fry were at the time. They were anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks older than the natural spawn. And I mentioned we have to fly. We started off by flying to Texas. The state of Texas was kind enough to let us have some fry. And this box that our hatchery coordinator, David Roddy, is holding is about 50,000 fry. So we could put about 5 boxes on the plane. Our pilot would fly down, spend the night, load up next morning, and fly back and take them to to the various hatcheries. And then they would put those fry out into the ponds and keep them there for about 6 weeks. And then they would be 2 to 2.5 inches long, get them out of there, and then go stock them into the various bodies of water. Just kind of an idea of the creeks, the embayments that we stocked and still stock at Chickamauga: Richland Creek and Mud Creek and Grasshopper Creek. Those are the 3 embayments that we chose because of their habitat. Had some good aquatic vegetation in those areas, and it was just a bit more suitable habitat that we felt like the fingerlings would survive in, as opposed to some other places. And so in 2010, we did some genetics testing, and as you can see, we started seeing that at this point in time in our genetics testing, we could only tell if they were either a pure northern or some type of Florida bass. It might have been a pure Florida or what you'll see in a minute, a back cross or even a hybrid, but had some kind of percent of a Florida gene in them. And the average for in 2010 was about 34% when you add up all the 3 sites together. And so that was pretty good, because I remember we were looking for to increase the genetic composition to about 15% initially. In 2012, we did same sort of thing, replicated that, and even went further down the reservoir and started seeing even more. We were up to about 45% average of Florida bass in there. And then in 2012 also, there was this made headlines in the bass world anyway. These guys caught, in a tournament, they caught 5 bass that weighed almost 45 pounds. So they averaged almost 9 pounds apiece, which is almost unheard of. So we knew we had the genetics, and the second part of our goal for stocking the Florida bass was to produce large bass. So the question was, were these big bass Florida bass, or were they just happen to be have good growth rates and everything, and were they just northern bass? So we wanted to see that. So what we did was we collected about 50 bass from bass tournaments in the spring of 2013, and each of the bass they had to be 8 pounds or bigger, which is a very big bass. And so and the biggest was a 13.5 pounder. It was a non-tournament. We still got the fin clip from it anyway. And you may remember this, that all of them, every single one of them had some kind of Florida gene in them. Most of them were hybrids. And the hybrid is the first generation cross between a pure Northern and a pure Florida. That's a hybrid, or also known as F1, the letter F1. And then the back cross could be a cross between a hybrid and a pure Florida, or a hybrid and a Northern, or even a hybrid and another hybrid. So it's like the second generation and beyond. We call those FX. And X could be generation 2, 3, 4, 5, or beyond. So interesting, there were no pure Northerns, no pure Floridas in those 48 bass that we ended up testing with the fin clips that we got. So we're real excited. We thought, okay, we've done great. What do we do now? Lance Ryder, we're not going to stock peacock bass. He asked me that I don't know how many times over the years, but that's one recommendation that we are not going to make. But now what? So with the excitement and all that about the Florida bass and how well they're doing, of course the word spread, and other anglers across the state wanted us to stock their waters wherever they live. And so we were getting some pressure and some requests from other anglers to do that, as well as some commissioners wanting us to consider stocking other waters. And then Commissioner Cox made the request, I think, at the September commission meeting to see what it would take to stock Florida bass into all the reservoirs in the state. One of the concerns that we had were the back crosses, particularly Chickamauga. Do they grow as well as a native of the northern largemouth bass? We were concerned that what if the back cross turned out to have the traits of a northern bass, which don't grow quite as fast or quite as well as the Floridas, and maybe the trait of the Florida bass, they don't bite as well. So what if we had a back cross that turned out to be a population of smaller fish that don't bite? That's not very good. So that was one of the things we were concerned about. And so we decided to try to answer some of those questions, and that's what took us a little bit longer than probably some people would like us to do, to answer some of the questions and concerns we had. And so we did a lake-wide evaluation in 2014 in spring, and typically we would go out one time and collect bass, get the information, weight and length, and then the fin clip to see what kind of fish it was. But this time we did that, but we did it over about a 6-week period, because we want to make sure that we collected the variable of perhaps that Florida bass might move up into the shallow water to spawn later than the native Northerns would. And so we did collect these over a period of time of about 6 weeks, I believe, and we got over 200 fish too, which is a pretty significant population to test. We found out at this point in time, in about 2000 and I guess just a couple of years ago, we were able to tell a little bit more details about the percent makeup of Floridas. And I remember in 2010, we could only tell if they were a northern or maybe some type of Florida bass. Well, now we got a little more sophisticated, not us, but our genetics person, and they were able to tell us if it was perhaps a F1 or a hybrid, or pure Florida, pure northern, or maybe the FX that I was talking about. And as you can see from this slide, or maybe you can't, but a lot of FX bass were showing up in Chickamauga in 2014 from the collections that we did. The next question was, okay, we know we got the percentage there. What about the growth of these fish? Are they not as good? Are they better? So I don't like to show graphs like this too much, but this is interesting because the red line on the bottom indicates the trend line, not the trend line, but the growth curve for the total length for northerns, and the blue line above it is for the FX. And so in this particular case, there's not a huge difference as they grow older, but they do, at least they're not, the FX aren't growing slower or less than the natives are. So that was a good question we had. And plus you see the outliers, these circles up here are FX fish, which are bigger fish. These are the ones that the fishermen want. And then the weight is pretty much, it's similar to that too. On the growth curve there, the fish as they get bigger and older, the FX seem to outperform or at least stay with the northerns, and they're not less. So that was a big consideration, big concern we had. And still, this is really a relatively short-term project so far. It's only been going on for, at most maybe 10 years or so. So we don't know down the road what may be happening, but at least for now, it doesn't look that bad. So that was the question we wanted to answer before we made any further steps. We also took some samples from a few other lakes, Reelfoot Lake, Old Hickory Lake, Percy Priest, Normandy, and Woods, to try to get an idea of what their genetic background was. In Reelfoot Lake and Old Hickory, as you can see, were almost 100%, if not 100% northerns. Percy Priest Lake is a pretty high percentage of well, here it is right here. Old Hickory was 100%. Percy Priest was about 90% northerns. Woods Reservoir was 82%. And Normandy, interestingly enough, was 38%. And I say that because Normandy Lake is a relatively new lake. It was stocked, I believe, back in the late 60s or 70s, but we don't know the origin of the fish. We don't know, because we didn't provide the fish for stocking. TVA, who manages the dam, they're the ones that stocked it. We assumed that probably stocked it with some Florida bass genes over time, but they didn't do it every year, but they did it initially at least. So now what? First, to address the Commissioner Cox's request, what would it take to stock all waters in Tennessee with Florida bass? So if we did that, if we just did what he asked us to do and just stocked, there's about 35 reservoirs, there's 470,000 acres of these reservoirs, and at a stocking rate of 5 per acre, it would mean we would need to come up with about 2,350,000 fingerlings or more. And at 26 cents per fingerling, it would cost about $600,000 a year or more. This is an annual stocking. It would also mean that we would reduce our production of walleye and sauger at our hatcheries to make up space that we would need to raise all these Florida largemouth bass fingerlings, so to keep them in there. So it would probably reduce about 44% if we took the fry and did that. So just some of the concerns and limitations, back crosses. You've heard me talk about the back crosses. We're still not 100% sold and on board with what could happen down the road with those, but at least for Chickamauga, for recent times, it doesn't appear to be terribly bad. Genetic integrity. The Old Hickory Lake and Percy Priest Lake having a very high percent of northern largemouth bass. We may need to consider protecting those fish. Who knows when we might need them down the road if something happens with places that we have stocked the Florida bass in. Heating degree today zone, I haven't talked about that yet, but I'll talk about it in a second. It's just I'll wait. A habitat and lake productivity, I mentioned the eutrophic lake, which is a highly productive lake. We feel like that's the places that we need to consider stocking. That's where we've had luck with Chickamauga. Some of the agency lakes that we've had some luck, and the habitat is as well is conducive in those bodies of water too. Suitable forage, plenty of shad, plenty of fish for the bass to eat. There needs to be a bunch of that. Hatchery space is a limitation that we have to consider. The wise use of sportsman's dollars. We don't want to be stocking fish. Well, we don't think that they will do that well. We don't put them in a body of water just because they're a body of water. We think we should just put them where we think they're going to do well. And the source of the fry, again, it's a big concern. Right now, we get them from the state of Texas. Their director, they could get a new director, or the director could just change his mind and say, no, you can't have any more. And as well, we have to come up with a bunch more. So source of fry is one of our biggest concerns and limitations. I mentioned the heating degree day zone, and this is the map that we showed. This is what we initially had back in late 90s, early 2000, about where we might consider stocking Florida bass. And the area that are gray is suitable for what we think may be Florida largemouth bass, suitable for them. Also, there's in our neighboring states of Arkansas and Oklahoma, they stock a lot of Florida bass in their states and their waters. And just in conversation and things we picked up in literature, I don't know if you can see that well, but the dots, the orange dots below the red line are places they feel like they've had success in stocking the Florida bass. And above them, the gray ones are ones that they've stocked they don't feel like they've had luck. And there's one orange one and one red one, and the orange one is a small power plant lake that's heavily influenced by the water temperature from coming out of the power plant. It's not a very big lake. And the red one is one that, even though some magazines or people may consider that successful, we looked at the growth rates and things like that from the bass in this lake, and they were not better. In fact, they weren't quite as well as some of our lakes that we don't stock Florida bass, like Old Hickory Lake. If you put that line on across in Arkansas, these are some of the lakes that they stock. And most of the lakes that Arkansas and Oklahoma stock are relatively smaller lakes. Arkansas does stock Lake Ouachita, which is a big lake, and then there's another one, I can't think of the name of it, but for the most part, they stock smaller lakes that anywhere from 2 to 3 or 400 acres in size. But if you put that line on across in Tennessee, you can see that's where Chickamauga is. So we're kind of, if you just drew that line straight across, that's in line with what Arkansas and Oklahoma have had success, or what they consider success in stocking Florida bass. Back in December, this past December, our fisheries biologists from across the state met to discuss the Florida bass, and we invited this guy, Dr. Eric Peatman from Auburn University, to give us an overview. I've heard Dr. Peatman speak at a Southeastern Association meeting back in October, and he is doing some work on Florida bass genetics, mostly in Alabama and Georgia, but this is a map of the state of Alabama, and they have been able to define the genetic frequency, or maybe not frequency, but the percent of Florida bass genes in a fish in a lot more detail than anybody's ever done. And so you can see the numbers, as well as the little pie charts there, that some of their lakes they've had luck with, some of them they don't think, this is Alabama, by the way, don't think they've had as much luck with. And if you look at this little rectangle here, this is in the Mobile River Basin, and for years Alabama stocked lakes within the Mobile River Basin, and they just never really saw many big fish in there, and they didn't know why. But it turns out that there was probably a subspecies of bass similar to the Florida bass that adapted to the Mobile River Basin and the salinity and things like that, and they just that's the fish that's going to be in there, no matter what they try to do to it. So Alabama stocks a lot of waters, but they don't necessarily consider every one of them a success, and they're backing off of the ones they don't consider a success. One of the other things that Dr. Peatman told us was that they're finding that lakes that have these extreme drawdowns, or these winter drawdowns that are pretty steep, the Florida bass don't do well in those lakes either. So that was interesting for him to tell us that. We sort of figured that, but they can determine that through genetics. And even though I hate to admit it, biologists do make mistakes. Alewife is one. It's okay. Alewife is a fish that we intentionally stocked in Dale Hollow Lake and in Watauga Lake. And we did it back in the 80s. And we did it because this is a forage fish that is more of a northern fish, but it's hardy. It can survive the cold winters. Our threadfin shad in those lakes would die off every couple of years, if not almost every year. We'd have to go back and stock them. Gizzard shad, sometimes they're so big that they're not available for some of the smaller fish, and so the alewives don't get that big, really. They relatively small size, and so we put them in there, and it turns out that somehow alewives impact the successful recruitment of walleye. And everywhere we've had them, we have to stock a lot of walleye in our lakes, and I mentioned that at the stocking presentation I made at last month's commission meeting as well. And there's another fish called a coosa bass, or red-eye bass, that's native to the far southeast corner of our state, and we've stocked them in the Cumberland Plateau and a few places, and they're competing with our native smallmouth bass and integrating and breeding with them, and in some cases it's not a good thing. So we do want to be cautious about what we do. We don't want to just go out there and put a bunch of fish in there, and we have made mistakes in the past, believe it or not. Okay, with all that in mind, here we go. So we currently stock, I mentioned Gibson County Lake, Lake Graham, and Browns Creek Lake. We only stocked Kentucky Lake for about 5 or 6 years, I think, at the most, and we haven't stocked it in a few years. And the one thing about Kentucky Lake, the Harmons Creek, we used to stock it. Those fingerlings that we stocked came from Humboldt hatchery, and they were spawned out of Humboldt hatchery, so they didn't really have the size advantage that the Chickamauga fingerlings had, and so we don't think we had much luck there because of that. But we're currently stocking Chickamauga Lake, so all these 4 sites here we're going to continue to stock. Thank you very much. I'm kidding. Okay, so we're going to go next. Our proposed stocking is to go to Nickajack Lake. Nickajack is just below Chickamauga Lake as far as the Tennessee River system goes, and the habitat there is very similar, if not better, than Chickamauga Lake. We've always thought that'd be a great a lake to try to put some Florida bass in. So it's about 10,000 acres or so. So that's one of the sites that we're going to go with. We're also going to recommend to go to Watts Bar Lake, which is above Chickamauga Lake, immediately above it. A couple of reasons that we're considering stocking these is, for whatever reason, we're already finding some Florida bass genes in Nickajack, probably from downflow migration from Chickamauga Lake, and then Watts Bar Lake, upstream migration, as well as some fishermen that may be fishing in Watts Bar, lock through the dam and go fish at Chickamauga, and they go back up into Watts Bar and they have their weigh-ins and they release their fish. So we're seeing some Florida bass genetics there too. So we figure we might as well go ahead and accelerate this. Watts Bar's got good habitat too. It's a eutrophic lake. It's a very productive lake. It doesn't have the aquatic vegetation that the other two have, but it's still got some pretty good habitat. And then one we're throwing out there that is Fort Loudon Lake in Knoxville. And that's a very productive lake. Maybe a little bit on the outer fringes of where we normally would recommend stocking, but for reasons that I'll tell you in a minute, that's one of the lakes that we're considering stocking as well with Florida bass. Then back to Kentucky Lake, we're gonna go back to Harmons Creek, and 3 or 4 other embayments. We've settled on those, but we're going to stock 3 or 4 embayments there. And normally, and as you see, it's kind of in the middle of the state as far as Kentucky Lake goes, but the lower part, which is the upstream part further south, doesn't have the habitat. It's more of a riverine system, and that part there that we've circled has got some pretty good habitat, and it's got some aquatic vegetation as well. Notice I put this green circle around this part of the Tennessee River because this is Guntersville, Lake Guntersville, which everybody in the world thinks has got the best bass fishing outside of Chickamauga now, and Alabama has stocked it with Florida bass. But it's part of you can see the pattern here, it's part of the chain, all the main stem Tennessee River chain. And since they've got them already there, and we're going to go up this way, that's one of the things we, as biologists and staff, are recommended is to stay within the main stem Tennessee River tributary, not go up into the main stem reservoir, not go up into the tributary reservoirs. They have the drawdowns and things like that are not as productive, but keep it in the main stem. We're also going to propose to stock Parsons Lake near Memphis. It's not a very big, but it's an agency lake in the southwest part of our state. We're going to supplementally stock some bass there, some Florida bass of some type. One thing you see missing here is the Cumberland River drainage area here. Old Hickory Lake, Percy Priest Lake, Cordell Hull. We felt like this would be an area that we do not want to stock. We're not in favor of stocking it. It doesn't have the habitat, doesn't have the water quality. It's outside the zone. It's got 100% northern largemouth bass or a high percentage northern largemouth bass, which we may need down the road. We don't know yet. So we want to take a precautionary approach and not stock those areas right there. That's a big X. And then the eastern part of the state as well, because of the drawdowns, because of the same reasons I described. The habitat is not as good there, it's not as productive. We just don't feel like those would be suitable places to stock the Florida bass and go on. So that's the proposal. Quite a bit of stocking. I think we're stepping up to kind of give you an idea of what it's going to cost and how many. We're going to have to stock. We're going to need about 750,000 fingerlings to to go on with this, to meet the demand for stocking in this proposal. And just as a comparison, the state of Alabama stocks anywhere from 400,000 to 700,000 fingerlings a year. So we're going to be stocking more than they are if we can get the fish. At 26 cents a fingerling, it would cost about $195,000 a year if we bought those. We could purchase the fry, like we get the fry free from the state of Texas now, but we could buy them for 4 cents a piece, and that would cost us about $40,000 a year. We could also, when I say retrofit our hatcheries to produce early fry, we could somehow equip our hatcheries with the ability to warm the water up so that would stimulate the Florida bass to spawn earlier, and maybe 2 or 3 weeks earlier in the year than the natives do. We might be able to produce our own fish at some of our hatcheries. We could purchase hatchery space in the state of Texas or Florida. Somebody suggested that, threw it out there. I don't see we can do that, but it's an idea. Or we can pick up fry, if they will allow us, from several states in the South, like Texas, 300,000, Florida, 300,000, Louisiana, 400,000. I put those numbers up there because we have made contact with those states, and they've agreed to give us these fry about the middle of April. That'll be another thing we have to deal with, because our pilot would have to fly down to each of these locations, spend the night, fly back the next day, and then fly down again and come back. So it's going to take up a lot of time. The weather conditions have got to be perfect. There's a little bit of cost involved. It's not as bad as having to buy them, but it's still probably $4,000 or $5,000 in her cost. Our pilot's a female, and as well as spend the night and the airplane fuel cost. This is important for us to do. We have to do genetics work to get the baseline data. We have to go in before we stock, or at least sometime before, and get an idea of what's there, because we won't know how we're going to do or how we do if we don't get an idea of what's there now. And we know that that's expensive. Currently, we have to pay about $55 for each fish fin that we do a genetic analysis, and we're going to need quite a few of them to do the baseline data work for all those reservoirs that we're talking about. So anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 a year. What about the F1 Florida bass that we've heard so much about? That the American Sport Fish gave an excellent presentation at the last commission meeting about the F1. They call them tiger bass. They've got they got their own specific brand name for the F1s that they breed down in Montgomery, Alabama. They do well, as the presentation indicated. And they said it, and particularly really almost entirely in the smaller reservoirs, smaller lakes, not reservoirs. Almost everything they stock are small. And I mentioned to Don Keller, one of the owners, I asked him, don't you stock just the small lakes? He said, oh no, we stock one that's 1,000 acres. Now that's a big lake, but it's not like a 10,000 or 30,000 reservoir that we have in our system. So I think, and also these F1s do better if you're stocking them in a body of water that has no bass at all in there. In other words, you're initially stocking, or if you drained it and started over again, you put them in there. They do better in those lakes. Supplementally stock them on top of a population, they don't do as well. I don't think, I don't think they will advocate that as much either. But I do have a sort of a plan for possibly using some of the F1s. Tennessee State Park lakes scattered across our state. We have a memorandum of agreement with Department of Environment and Conservation, and that's that we will visit their state park lakes annually to provide technical guidance. We'll sample the fish populations, provide recommendations, and we'll provide state lakes with surplus fish when available, and we'll provide technical assistance in liming and weed control. That's if our time allows, and it hasn't really, we've done some of this, we haven't done as much as we should, or really I wish we had. But one of the things that also we will incorporate in the purchase of herbicides, fertilizer, and release. All this is if we had surplus of everything, including time to work on this, in which I said we haven't. So, but what I proposed to our guys at the meeting in December was that we put a special effort out to evaluate the status of these lakes in this coming year. We check to see if we determine if they're out of balance. We recommend management, and some of the management practices may be tweak with regulations or stocking. It could be just stocking catfish or something like that. Or we might recommend to completely renovate and restock. Some of the lakes that I'm aware of anywhere in the state park lakes, and by the way, they're anywhere from about 15 acres to some, one of them is about 700 acres, but most of them are anywhere from the 15 to 50 acre size they've got. And there's probably about 20 to 25 of them across the state. But a lot of these lakes have bass crowded or bluegill crowded lakes, in which nothing's been done to them. They've been stocked for 40 or 50 years. Over time, this is just a theory of mine. I'm not sure if it has there been a paper on it or not, but over time, the faster growing aggressive fish get caught out, no matter what species it is. And the slower growing, less aggressive fish remains in the population. And over time, I think you end up with a population of slower growing, less aggressive fish. Renovate and restock, you put a brand new stock of fish in there, and I think that really helps with the growth rates and everything else. So we may recommend bluegill, red or sunfish, channel catfish, crappie, threadfish, and F1 Florida bass. These state park lakes would be an ideal situation where F1 Florida bass would work, in our opinion, well. And in some cases where the lake is, like I think Fall Creek Falls State Park has got a 345 acre lake, and then I mentioned Pin Oak Lake, and Natchez Trace has got about a 700 acre lake. We may consider stocking some F1 Florida bass to these smaller populations. We feel like we can add enough in there to make a difference. The F1 Florida bass stocking in the reservoirs, we would have to stock a tremendous number per acre in order to impact the number to see them. We wouldn't want to stock the F1s to influence the genetics so much. That's why we're proposing the pure Floridas in these other lakes, where we want to influence the genetics and not necessarily the number. But in these smaller lakes, we think we can do that. And then, of course, they can advertise and promote that they've got the F1 Florida bass in their lakes. Right now, in my opinion, I'm speaking just my opinion here. A lot of people that go to state parks usually go for another reason. They go to camp or hike or something, and if there's a lake there, they might fish. But I don't think they really go, their intent is not to go there to go catch some fish, because the fishing is wonderful there. If we can make these changes in there and advertise that there's Florida bass in there and really make a difference in there, I think that will be a destination for a lot of them for these state parks. And that will of course increase revenue for the state parks, should increase some license sales for us. And one of the beauties is, if something happens and it doesn't work in these smaller lakes, we can always reevaluate in 5-10 years. If we have to, we can renovate them and start all over again with something else. We can't do that in the big reservoirs. Once we put the fish in there, we can't drain them, we can't kill them out, but we can do it in the smaller lakes. That's really all I've got about the Florida bass. I've got this slide up here. I just wanted to share this with y'all. We've talked a lot about stocking at the last commission meeting, and then we talked about the hatchery overview at the one before that, and we talked about the fact that we stock a lot of fish for maybe a smaller percentage of people. We have a great diversity of fishing in Tennessee that most states around us, or at least south of us, don't share, at least for the freshwater part of it. That's French for expenditures, yes. Thank you. Yeah. I took French in high school. I like to throw it in every once in a while, Monsieur. Thank you for pointing that out. I appreciate that. So anyway, this was taken from the 2011 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey National Survey that looked at various aspects. The days of freshwater fishing. Florida, which is the self-proclaimed freshwater fishing capital of the world, 25 million days of fishing. Texas, 22 million. Texas is a big state that got a lot of water. Tennessee's third, almost 17 million. And look at the other states like Louisiana, they're close to us. Arkansas, Missouri, South Carolina, Alabama. Those, they're all great and wonderful, but we do a lot, and we think a lot of this because of our diversity of fishing in Kentucky. And then over here, the expenditures, if you look at that, Tennessee ranks number 1 as far as angler expenditures on an annual basis. So I just want to share that with you because we may not be able to stock a lot of largemouth bass like a lot of people would like for us to do, anglers, but we do stock a diversity of fish, and we think the diversity leads to a lot more anglers, and they spend a lot of money, and so we must be doing something right. And that's all I got. If there are any questions from the commission? Any questions?